candle light, 1,000 white roses, and a silver cup filled with death. Inside the great chapel of St. Bartholomew's, London held its breath. Lady Eve Rees stood at the altar in white lace, her veil trembling with every tearful blink. Beside her stood the man half of England feared, and the other half envied, Harrison Stone, the Duke of Ashbury. They said his heart had turned to stone years ago. They said he had never once smiled at anything living. They were about to be proven wrong in the worst possible way. The wine of blessing was lifted toward the bride. No one in the crowded pews knew the cup had been poisoned. No one, except the groom. Harrison looked at the chalice. Then he looked at Eve, and for the first time in 10 long years, the heartless Duke smiled. It was gentle. It was warm. It was goodbye. Before Eve could speak, he lifted the cup from her gloved hands and drank every last drop. 3 heartbeats later, the most powerful nobleman in England collapsed at his own wedding. His burgundy coat spread across the white marble like spilled wine. His bride screaming his name as she dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms. The guests believed they were watching a murder. In truth, they were watching the greatest act of love London would ever whisper about. Who poisoned the cup? Why was the bride meant to die? And why did a man famous for having no heart trade his life for a woman who believed she hated him? Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Greetings, my noble viewers, and welcome to Forbidden Palace. I trust this day finds you well and in excellent spirits. As we journey toward the grand milestone of 1,000 subscribers, your support is humbly requested. If you find delight in tales of mystery, romance, betrayal, and royal intrigue, kindly subscribe, leave a like upon this video, and join our growing house of noble storytellers. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, from which corner of the world do you watch? And what hour does the clock strike in your land at this very moment? Every subscription, every like, and every comment brings us one step closer to our goal, and for that, we are truly grateful. Thank you for your support. Now, without further delay, let us return to our story. 3 months before the wedding, the trouble began with a newspaper. London, in the spring of 1867, loved nothing more than the fall of a respectable family, and that morning, the papers served one up on a silver tray. Lord Wells Rees, accused of robbing hospital charity, the headline shouted. By noon, every drawing room in Mayfair was chewing on the Rees name like a dog with a bone. Lady Eve Rees read the article standing in her father's study, her hands so steady it frightened her. She was 21, with golden brown curls, wide expressive eyes, and the kind of quiet beauty that made strangers stare a moment too long. But beauty pays no debts, and it silences no gossip. Her father sat slumped behind his desk, a man of 64, looking suddenly 90. Lord Wells Rees had made foolish investments. That much was true. He had trusted the wrong agents and signed papers he barely read. But steal from sick children, never. Eve knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. "Papa," she said softly, "we will fight this." "With what, my dear?" His voice cracked like old parchment. "The money is gone. The proof is forged so cleverly that even I would convict me. They mean to put me in a debtor's cell before autumn." Eve wanted to scream. Instead, she folded the newspaper neatly, because a lady does not fall apart in front of a man who is already broken. That evening, the invitations stopped arriving. Friends of 30 years crossed the street to avoid them. Lady Logan, the sharpest tongue in London society, was heard declaring at a supper party that the Rees family had always smelled faintly of shopkeepers, and she, for one, had never been fooled. Then, 1 week later, a black carriage bearing a silver crest rolled up their drive, and Destiny knocked twice on the front door. The visitor did not wait to be announced properly. He walked into the study, the way winter walks into a garden, quiet, cold, and impossible to ignore. Harrison Stone, the Duke of Ashbury, 32 years old, dark-haired, granite-jawed, and famous across England for two things: his enormous fortune and his complete lack of mercy. He placed a single document on the desk. "Lord Rees," he said, in a voice like a closed door, "I will pay every farthing of your debt and end the prosecution against you. In return, your daughter becomes my wife before the summer ends. You have until Friday to decide." He bowed to Eve with perfect icy courtesy and left without waiting for an answer. Eve stood frozen in the middle of the room, fury and terror fighting inside her like two cats in a sack. Sold. That was the only word for it. She was being purchased, the way a man purchases a horse or a painting. What she could not have known, what no one in England knew, was that the cold man in the black carriage had folded his hands together to stop them shaking, and had not breathed properly until his estate gates closed behind him. London had 100 stories about Harrison Stone, and not one of them was kind. They said he had evicted a bishop's cousin for late rent. They said 3 merchants had gone bankrupt merely for crossing him at the Royal Exchange. They said that when his own uncle begged forgiveness for betraying him years ago, the Duke had listened in silence, finished his tea, and ruined the man by Christmas. Some of the stories were even true, but no story mentioned that Harrison Stone had been orphaned at 14, handed a rotten estate drowning in his late father's secret debts, and surrounded by smiling relatives who robbed him while patting his head. He had learned early that warmth was a currency thieves accepted gladly, so he had stopped offering it. Coldness, he discovered, was armor, and armor had kept him alive. Eve knew none of this when she was summoned to Ashbury House to discuss the wedding arrangements. The house itself made her breath catch. Marble floors, towering windows, portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames. And at the end of the long gallery stood the Duke himself, dressed not in fashionable black, but in a deep burgundy velvet coat, trimmed with gold embroidery, an ivory waistcoat, and a white cravat, folded with military precision. He looked less like a bridegroom and more like a king reviewing troops. "Lady Eve," he did not smile, "the wedding shall be the last Saturday of August, at St. Bartholomew's. Your father's creditors have already been paid." "How efficient," Eve said, lifting her chin. "Tell me, Your Grace, do you always buy your brides, or am I a special occasion?" Somewhere behind her, a footman choked quietly. Harrison studied her for a long moment. If she had known him better, she might have seen something flicker in those tired grey eyes. Surprise, perhaps even admiration. But all he said was, "You will want for nothing, except a choice." "Choices," he replied quietly, "are a luxury. I learned that, younger than you did." He turned to the window, and the conversation was over. Eve left Ashbury House, convinced she had just met the coldest man God ever made. She did not see him stand at that window for an hour after her carriage disappeared. She did not know that upstairs, locked in a drawer, lay a small watercolor painting of a charity garden party from 2 summers past, a painting he had bought at auction for a shameful price, because in one corner of it, laughing beneath a plum tree, stood a girl with golden brown curls, whose name he had carried around ever since like a stone in his pocket. The heartless Duke had a heart. He had simply hidden it so well that even he sometimes forgot where it was. Every poison needs a sweet coating, and Bradley Chandler was the sweetest man in London. He arrived at the Rees townhouse 2 days after the engagement was announced, carrying lilies, sympathy, and a smile polished like silverware. Bradley was handsome in a soft, comfortable way. Neat, light brown hair, pale blue eyes, a voice made for consoling widows and charming aunts. He had been a friend of the family for 6 years. and Eve trusted him the way one trusts a warm fire in winter. "My poor dear Eve," he sighed, taking her hands in the drawing room. "When I heard the news, I could not sleep. Ashbury, of all men. Do you know what they call him? The Heartless Duke." "Yes, Bradley. All of London has been kind enough to remind me. It is worse than the name." He lowered his voice, glancing at the door like a man sharing state secrets. "I have heard, from people close to the courts, that the evidence against your father appeared far too conveniently. Papers forged by an expert hand, an expensive hand. Ask yourself, Eve, who in England had the money to destroy Lord Rees, and then arrived a week later to collect his daughter like a debt?" The suggestion slid into Eve like a splinter, small, deep, impossible to ignore. "You believe the Duke ruined my father to force this marriage?" "I believe," Bradley said gently, "that wolves do not rescue lambs. They herd them." He pressed her hand. "Whatever happens, remember I am your friend, your only honest friend. If ever you need to escape that man, come to me first. Promise me." She promised. And in the corner of the room, pretending to dust a perfectly clean shelf, her lady's maid Jodie Burns watched Bradley Chandler with narrowed eyes and thought, privately, that no man on earth was that sorry about anything unless he had caused it himself. What neither woman knew was this: Bradley Chandler was drowning. 6 years of gambling debts, secret loans, and forged signatures had hollowed him out like a rotten tree. He had borrowed against the Rees fortune's future, having schemed for 2 years to marry Eve himself. The Duke's proposal had wrecked everything. Worse still, Bradley was no longer working alone. A small circle of corrupt noblemen, men whose profitable schemes the Duke's parliamentary reforms threatened to expose, had found in Bradley the perfect instrument. Their bargain was simple and monstrous. Remove the bride, let the scandal of a poisoned wedding bury the Duke, and share the spoils of 2 ruined houses. That evening, in a private room above a gambling club off Regent Street, Bradley raised a glass with men whose names appeared on hospital boards and church committees. "To the wedding of the season," one of them chuckled. Bradley smiled his perfect smile. "To the funeral of the season," he corrected softly. "Pray, gentlemen, do not confuse the two. Everyone else will." If London society had ever bothered to ask a lady's maid for her opinion, half its scandals would have been solved by tea time. Jodie Burns was 25, freckled, quick-eyed, and blessed with a tongue that ran slightly faster than good manners allowed. She had served Eve for 7 years, and she loved her the fierce, practical way sisters love, with honesty first and flattery never. "You look miserable, my lady," she announced one morning, lacing Eve's corset. Which is odd, because most brides only look miserable after the wedding. "Jodie, merely an observation, my lady. My aunt says marriage is like a warm bath. Pleasant enough, until you sit in it too long and everything wrinkles." Eve laughed for the first time in a fortnight, then hated herself for it, and then laughed again. That was Jodie's true gift. She could sew a torn hem and a torn spirit in the same afternoon, but behind the jokes, Jodie was watching. She had grown up the niece of a police inspector, and Inspector Graham Burns had taught her one golden rule: people confess with their feet long before they confess with their mouths. So Jodie noticed things. She noticed that Mr. Chandler visited most often when Eve was at her saddest. She noticed that his sorrowful sighs never once reached his eyes. And on the 3rd Thursday of July, walking back from the milliner's, she noticed something far worse. There, in the shadowed lane behind St. Bartholomew's Chapel, stood Bradley Chandler, deep in whispered conversation, with a thin, nervous young man Jodie recognized as Peter Hale, an underservant of the chapel itself. She saw a small purse of coins change hands. She saw Peter Hale's face turn the color of old candle wax. Gentlemen did not pay chapel servants in back lanes, not for anything holy, she told Eve that very evening. "Bradley!" Eve shook her head, almost amused. "Jody, he probably gave the poor boy charity. It is exactly like him. Charity is given at the front door, my lady, in daylight, where everyone can admire you doing it. Back lane money is never charity. My uncle says so, and he has arrested enough of it to know. Your uncle arrests pickpockets, not gentlemen." "Only because gentlemen pick bigger pockets," Jody muttered. But Eve had already turned back to her letters, and the warning fell to the carpet unheard. So Jody did what sensible women have always done when nobody listens. She stopped talking and started working. She began keeping a small notebook in her apron pocket. Dates, visits, the names of Mr. Chandler's friends, and she wrote a careful letter to her uncle, Inspector Graham Burns, asking, purely out of curiosity of course, whether the name Bradley Chandler had ever passed across his desk. The reply came 4 days later, and it was short enough to memorize. "Curious you should ask. That name is written in 3 moneylenders' books and 1 brothel ledger, and gentlemen drowning in debt are the most dangerous creatures in England. Keep your eyes open and your lady close." Jody folded the letter, hid it inside her sewing box beneath a pincushion shaped like a fat little pig, and made herself a quiet promise. If nobody else intended to guard Lady Eve Rees, then heaven help them all. The lady's maid would. The first crack in Eve's certainty appeared in the most unlikely place, a hospital corridor smelling of carbolic soap. She had gone to St. Agnes Children's Hospital to apologize. Someone from the Rees family owed those wards that much, she felt, after the scandal of the stolen charity fund. She expected cold stares. Instead, the matron seized her hands with tears in her eyes. "Bless you, my lady, and bless his grace. The new beds arrived Tuesday. The coal debt is cleared, and the little ones had meat twice this week. When the fund went missing, we thought the doors would close by Michaelmas. Then his grace's man of business appeared. Quiet as a church mouse. Mind, we were sworn not to speak of it, and every farthing was restored. Eve went very still. His grace, of Ashbury, the very same, paid the whole charity debt from his own pocket, and threatened to buy the building if the newspapers were told." The matron chuckled. "Odd sort of threat, but there it is. The Heartless Duke, they call him. Well, heartless men do not pay for orphans' porridge in secret, do they, my lady?" All the way home, Eve stared out of the carriage window and argued with herself. A trick, surely. A rich man polishing his conscience. And yet, in secret, cruelty performs for an audience. Kindness that hides itself wants nothing back. The second crack came a week later, at Lady Logan's supper party. Lady Logan, glittering in emeralds and malice, waited until the table was full and the wine was poured. "Lady Eve, do settle a small dispute," she cooed. "We simply cannot agree. When a bride is purchased to pay her father's debts, does one still throw rice? Or would coins be more fitting?" Silverware paused. 20 faces turned. Eve's cheeks burned scarlet, and for one terrible moment, the room sharpened its claws. Then a chair scraped, and Harrison Stone rose to his feet at the far end of the table. "Coins would be fitting indeed, Lady Logan," he said, in that quiet voice that made whole ballrooms lean in. "Since you raise the subject of debts, shall we discuss the £4,000 your late husband still owes my estate, or shall we agree that some arithmetic is best left outside the dining room?" Silence. Lady Logan's fan stopped mid-flutter. Somewhere down the table, a young officer disguised a laugh as a cough and nearly injured himself doing it. Harrison sat down and calmly resumed his soup, having defended his bride without once raising his voice. Later, in the candlelit hall as the guests departed, Eve caught his sleeve. "You did not have to do that." "No," he agreed. "Then why?" He looked at her, really looked, the grey eyes tired and guarded and for half a second, achingly gentle. "Because they may say what they wish about me. I am accustomed to it, but they will not sharpen their tongues on you while I stand in the room." He bowed and walked to his carriage, leaving Eve alone beneath the chandelier with a dangerous new problem. It is very hard to hate a man properly once you have begun to wonder if you invented him. The carriage accident that was not an accident happened on the last Tuesday of July. Eve was due at the dressmaker's at 2 o'clock for her final gown fitting. At 1:30, as the horses were being harnessed, a rider in Ashbury livery thundered up the drive with a message. The Duke insisted, that Lady Eve postpone her journey and travel instead in his own carriage, which would arrive within the hour. Eve read the note twice and felt her temper rise like bread in a hot oven. Not married yet, and already he was commanding her comings and goings. He means to control me, Jody. First my journeys, then my letters, then my life. Bradley warned me precisely of this. Or, Jody said carefully, he knows something we do not. Men like His Grace don't send riders galloping through July heat for the pleasure of being irritating. Whose side are you on? Yours, my lady, which is why I'd rather you were angry in a safe carriage than agreeable in a broken one. Eve obeyed, furiously, and only because refusing would have caused a scene. It saved her life. That evening, the Rees family coachman examined the original carriage and turned grey as ash. The bolts of the front wheel had been cut nearly through, so cleverly that they would have held along the smooth drive and snapped at speed on the Kensington Road, where the way runs steep beside a stone embankment. At a gallop, the carriage would have overturned. People die in such accidents every season. No one asks questions. Jody wrote it all in her notebook with a hand that would not quite stay steady. Then she asked the stable boy quietly whether any stranger had been near the coach house. Only one, he said. A thin, nervous young fellow. 2 days passed, asking directions. Pale as candle wax. Peter Hale, the chapel servant, Bradley's back lane friend. Jody went cold from her collar to her boots. That same night, she wrote again to her uncle. No curiosity this time, but plain fear. And Inspector Graham Burns began, very quietly, to watch the movements of Mr. Bradley Chandler. As for the Duke, when Eve demanded to know how he had known to stop her journey, Harrison gave her nothing but a maddening half-answer. I received word that the road was unsafe. What word? From whom? Am I in danger, Your Grace? I have a right to know. You have a right to be protected, he said. Knowing can come after. It was the wrong answer. The answer of a man so used to carrying burdens alone that sharing one never occurred to him. Eve stormed away convinced, once again, that he was hiding something. She was right. He was hiding a great deal. A warning letter from his own investigator, 3 sleepless nights, and the slowly hardening certainty that someone in London wanted his bride dead before she ever became a duchess. He simply could not yet prove who. On the eve of the wedding, with the whole house asleep and the candles burned low, Eve did something no proper bride would dream of doing. She went to see the groom alone. She found Harrison in the library at Ashbury House, coat off, cravat loosened, staring into the fire like a man reading his own sentence there. He rose at once when she entered. For a moment, neither of them remembered how to speak. You should not be here, he said finally. No, but tomorrow I promise my whole life to a stranger, and I find I cannot sleep without asking him one question. She stepped closer, chin high, heart hammering. Do you want a wife, Your Grace? Or only a name on a contract? A debt that walks and pours your tea? I will marry you either way. My father's freedom is worth it, but I will know what I am walking into. The fire cracked. Harrison looked at her for a long time, and something in his face shifted, like ice on a river in the first week of spring. When I was 14, he said quietly, I told my uncle I loved him. He was the last person I ever said it to. Within a year, he had stolen half my inheritance and taught me what affection costs when it is spoken aloud. So I stopped speaking it. I built walls, and London mistook the walls for the man. He paused. Some men love quietly, Lady Eve, because the world has punished them for speaking. Eve's breath caught. And you, do you? love quietly. He was close enough now that she could see the firelight in his grey eyes, close enough that the air itself seemed to lean in. His hand rose, almost touched her cheek, and stopped, trembling slightly, a heartbeat from her skin. "Ask me again," he whispered, "when you are my wife by your own choosing, and not your father's ransom. I will not steal an answer you were forced to give. Not that one." He stepped back. The moment folded itself away like a letter never sent. Eve left the library with her hatred in ruins, and something far more frightening blooming in its place, and she lay awake until dawn, wondering how she had misjudged a man so completely. Across the city, in a rented room that smelled of tallow and fear, Bradley Chandler laid 3 gold sovereigns on a table in front of Peter Hale, beside a small blue glass bottle. Into the blessing cup, before the ceremony. Every drop. The bride drinks first. It is tradition. Bradley's voice was as smooth as ever, but his eyes were flat as coins. The carriage failed. This will not. Do it, and your mother's debts vanish. Refuse, and she learns what prison broth tastes like at her age. Peter Hale stared at the bottle, and his hands shook so badly the sovereigns rattled on the wood. "God forgive me," he whispered. "He won't," said Bradley pleasantly, putting on his hat. "But he is not on the guest list. Good night, Peter. Do enjoy the wedding." The last Saturday of August arrived dressed in gold. St. Bartholomew's had never looked so magnificent. 1,000 white roses climbed the marble pillars. Candles burned in tall, gilded stands, their light swimming across the stained glass saints, until the whole chapel glowed like the inside of a jewel. Every pew was full. Half of London had come to worship. The other half had come to watch a purchased bride and a heartless duke perform a marriage with no love in it. London, as usual, understood nothing. Eve appeared at the great doors on her father's arm, and even Lady Logan forgot to whisper. The bride wore white lace over ivory silk, the skirt full and trailing, the sleeves long and delicate as frost on a window. Pearl drops trembled at her ears. A crown of small white flowers held her long veil, and behind its mist, her eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall. She was frightened. She was magnificent. She walked like a queen going to a battlefield. At the altar, Harrison Stone turned to watch her come, and those standing nearest saw something no living soul had witnessed in 10 years. The Duke of Ashbury's composure failed him. Only for a moment, only in the eyes, but it failed. He wore deep burgundy velvet embroidered with gold, an ivory waistcoat, a white cravat, a single white rose at his breast. No black today, nothing of mourning, as if he had dressed deliberately for hope. When Eve reached him, he offered his hand, and she took it, and both pretended not to notice that neither hand was quite steady. "You are certain," he murmured, too low for the bishop to hear. "I am here," she whispered back. "Ask me the rest afterward." The ceremony began. Prayers rose with the incense. Vows were spoken, his voice level, hers clear, and rings exchanged, gold catching candlelight. Somewhere in the third pew, Jodie Burns cried into her handkerchief and pretended it was dust. Then came the old tradition of that chapel, the blessing cup. Wine, blessed at the altar, shared by bride and groom as their first act as husband and wife. The bride drinks first. A side door opened. Peter Hale came forward carrying the silver chalice on a velvet cushion, walking as if the floor were made of thin ice. And 3 small details, unnoticed by 300 guests, arranged themselves before the eyes of the one man in England, trained since boyhood, to notice everything. The first, the cupbearer's hands were trembling so violently that the wine shivered against the silver. The second, as the cushion passed, a faint scent reached the Duke. Beneath the wine's sweetness, a whisper of bitter almonds, thin as a ghost. The third, in the front pew, Bradley Chandler, sorrowful, sympathetic Bradley, who had dabbed his eyes throughout the vows, was watching the chalice travel toward Eve with the small, satisfied smile of a man watching his horse come first down the final stretch. The bishop blessed the cup. Peter Hale, grey-faced, lifted it toward the bride, and Eve, unknowing, closed her white-gloved hands around her own death and raised it to her lips. Time slowed for Harrison Stone the way it does for soldiers and drowning men. He had perhaps 2 seconds, and he spent them the way he had spent his whole life, calculating. Cry poison aloud, and what then? No proof. The wine spilled or switched in the chaos, Hale fled or silenced, Bradley shocked and sympathetic, and the plot would simply return. Next month, next winter, a loose wheel, a dark staircase, until one day it succeeded, and he was not there to stand in its way. His enemies would remain hidden, Eve would remain hunted, but a duke poisoned at the high altar before 300 witnesses, that could not be hidden, could not be hushed, could not be tried quietly. That would drag every rat into the light. And besides, beneath all the strategy, beneath the cold arithmetic, one simple truth outranked everything he had ever owned. Not her. Eve's lips had nearly touched the silver when his hand closed gently over the cup. She looked up, startled, and her heart broke a little because she thought he meant to shame her before all of London, to remind the purchased bride of her place. Her eyes flashed with hurt. Then she saw his face, and every angry thought died. The heartless duke was smiling at her, softly, sadly, the way a man smiles at the last beautiful thing he expects to see. "My lady, forgive me," he said quietly. "This is the only vow I know how to keep." He turned the chalice, set his lips where hers would have been, and drank it to the bottom. For a moment, nothing. The bishop blinked. The guests murmured at the odd reversal of tradition. Then the silver cup slipped from Harrison's fingers and rang against the marble like a funeral bell, and the Duke of Ashbury dropped to his knees, one hand pressed to his heart, the white rose crushed against burgundy velvet. "Harrison!" Eve's scream tore the chapel in half. She fell beside him, lace and silk pooling across the cold stone, and caught his head against her shoulder as the congregation rose in a roaring wave. Women shrieking, men shouting for a doctor, the bishop clutching his cross. "Why?" she sobbed, cradling his face in her hands, her veil falling around them both like snow. "Why would you—" "The wine," he managed, his breath already ragged, his lips turning grey. "Meant for you. Hale, trembling. Chandler, smiling. Remember that, Eve." Chandler was smiling. His hand found hers and gripped it with the last of his strength. "You asked if I love quietly. Forgive me. It appears I do." His eyes closed. His weight went slack in her arms. A dark stain of spilled wine spread across her white gown like blood. And in the front pew, for one unguarded heartbeat, Bradley Chandler's mask slipped, not into grief, but into fury. The wrong person had drunk. Jody Burns, fighting through the crowd toward her lady, saw that fury with her own eyes and branded it into her memory. Then Bradley arranged his face into horror, cried, "Murder! Someone has murdered the Duke," and began, ever so helpfully, pointing suspicion toward the ruined, desperate family of the bride. He had no idea that a sturdy man in a plain brown coat had been sitting quietly at the back of the chapel since morning. Inspector Graham Burns rose to his feet, put 2 fingers to his mouth, and whistled, and every door of St. Bartholomew's was suddenly filled with policemen. "Nobody leaves," the inspector announced calmly. "Weddings and crime scenes, ladies and gentlemen, the guest list stays put for both." They fought for the Duke's life for 9 days. The physicians said afterward that 3 things saved him: his own strong constitution, the doctor among the wedding guests who forced an emetic on him within minutes, and the simple mercy that the chalice had been prepared to kill a slender young woman, not a tall man with the shoulders of a rower. The dose that would have stopped Eve's heart before the carriage reached home left Harrison instead, at the edge of death, burning with fever in the great bed at Ashbury House. Eve never left him. Still in her wedding gown that first terrible night, wine-stained and wild-eyed, she refused laudanum, refused sleep, refused her father's pleading. She held the Duke's hand through the convulsions and the delirium, and when he raved in his fever, begging some long-dead uncle to give back what was stolen, begging a boy's forgotten God to let her live, take the estate, take everything, let her live. Eve pressed her forehead to his knuckles and wept for every cruel thing she had ever believed about him. "Come back to me," she whispered into the dark of the fourth night. "You are not permitted to die, Harrison Stone. You never asked me the question, and I never gave you my answer. Come back and collect it." Meanwhile, justice moved on quick feet. Peter Hale had collapsed before the police even reached him, and confessed everything between sobs: the money, the threats against his mother, the blue glass bottle, and the name behind it all. Jodie Burns marched into Scotland Yard with her apron notebook and her uncle at her side, and laid out dates, meetings, and the back lane payment behind the chapel with such crisp precision that the sergeant taking notes asked, entirely seriously, whether she wanted employment. "I have employment," Jodie sniffed. "I keep a duchess alive. The hours are dreadful." The search of Bradley Chandler's rooms buried him, gambling debts vast enough to sink a fleet. Letters from 3 noblemen, 2 earls and a viscount, all of whom sat on charity boards, and all of whom stood to lose fortunes under the Duke's parliamentary reforms, plotting in careless detail, sabotaged evidence that had framed Lord Wells Rees, the sabotaged carriage, the poisoned cup, and the tidy plan to hang the scandal around Ashbury's neck and carve up 2 great estates like a Sunday goose. Bradley was arrested at the Dover docks with a false passport and a lady's jewels that did not belong to him. He smiled his beautiful smile at Inspector Burns and offered him £500. "Make it 1,000, said the inspector pleasantly, "and I shall still arrest you, but I'll mention the bribe in court as well. Gentlemen drowning in debt, Mr. Chandler, should learn to stop swimming." On the 9th day, at 6:15 in the evening, Harrison Stone opened his eyes. The room was gold with sunset, and there, asleep in a chair against his bedside, still holding his hand, was his wife, pale, exhausted, and to him, more beautiful than every rose in that chapel put together. He moved his thumb weakly across her fingers, and Eve woke with a start, and for a moment they only looked at each other. "You stayed," he rasped. "You noticed," she said, laughing and crying at once. "The question," he whispered, "from the library. You may ask it now." Eve leaned close, her curls falling loose around them both. "Do you love quietly, Harrison Stone?" "No," said the heartless Duke, with the second smile of his new life. "Not anymore. I love you, Eve. Aloud, in daylight, in front of witnesses, if you can find any." "I shall fetch 300, she said. "They still owe us a wedding kiss." And she kissed him, softly, then not softly at all, while the sunset burned through the tall windows. And somewhere downstairs, Jodie Burns told a footman that if anyone disturbed their graces in the next hour, she would personally see them posted to the Orkneys. Dear noble viewers, as our tale draws near its final curtain, your presence in this palace means more than words can fully express. If this story stirred your heart, surprised your mind, or made you believe again in a love that proves itself through courage, kindly support Forbidden Palace by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing your thoughts below. Tell us in the comments, would you have trusted the Duke before the truth was revealed? Or would you, like Eve, have believed the charming rumors? Your voice gives life to this community, and every comment reminds us that these stories are not merely watched, they are felt. Now, let us close the palace doors gently and see how every soul in this tale received exactly what they deserved. The bride who was meant to die at the altar lived to become one of the most beloved duchesses in England. Bradley Chandler, who had dressed his evil in charm and his greed in sympathy, stood trial before the very society he had performed for. The evidence was read aloud for 2 full days, and by the end of it, his beautiful smile had nowhere left to live. He lost his name, his freedom, and every borrowed shilling, and spent the rest of his years in a prison cell, writing letters of complaint that nobody answered. The 2 earls and the viscount who had financed the plot were exposed in open court. Their titles could not save them. If anything, their titles made the fall louder. Their corrupt charity schemes were dismantled, the stolen hospital funds were traced and returned, and Parliament passed the Duke's reforms within the year, with, it was noted, remarkably little opposition. Lord Wells Rees was cleared of every charge. The newspapers that had feasted on his ruin printed their apologies in small letters on quiet pages, as newspapers do. He did not mind. He spent his remaining years as the most devoted patron St. Agnes Children's Hospital ever had, and the wards he had once been accused of robbing were, in time, renamed in his honour. Lady Logan, whose tongue had fed on scandal for 30 years, discovered that drawing rooms have long memories. Having mocked the innocent so loudly, she found the fashionable doors of London closing one by one, until the sharpest wit in Mayfair was left sharpening it alone at home. Peter Hale, the trembling cupbearer, was shown mercy for his confession. The Duke himself paid his mother's debts, the very chain Bradley had used to bind him, and the young man spent his life in honest service, telling anyone who asked that the most frightening thing in England was not the heartless Duke, but a kind voice, asking for one small favour. Jodie Burns received a fine cottage, a generous pension, and the honour of becoming the Duchess's most trusted companion, though she kept her apron notebook, in case any more gentlemen take up poisoning. She later joked that saving a duchess was easier than lacing a wedding corset. Though not, she admitted, by much. And Harrison Stone, the Duke of Ashbury, recovered slowly, but never alone. Eve stayed at his side, reading to him, teasing him without mercy, and reminding him daily that a man who could smile at death for love had never once been heartless. The following spring, they repeated their vows in a small chapel filled with children from St. Agnes, and this time, when the blessing cup was raised, husband and wife drank from it together, laughing. For when he had finally woken from the poison, he had found his bride holding his hand, and this time she was smiling too, not because she had been saved, but because she had chosen him. Educational value and moral lessons. 1. Reputation is not the same as truth. London called Harrison heartless and Bradley charming, and London was wrong on both counts. Judge people by their actions over time, not by the stories told about them. 2. Charming voices can carry dangerous lies. Bradley's warmth was a weapon, kindness that isolates you from others, feeds your fears, and asks for your trust, while offering no proof, deserves careful examination in any century. 3. Silence can destroy trust, even when love is real. Harrison's refusal to explain himself nearly cost him everything. Love must be spoken, as well as proven. Protection, without communication, looks exactly like control. 4. False accusations ruin lives. Verify before you condemn. Lord Rees was destroyed by forged papers and eager gossip. Justice must rest on evidence and fair investigation, never on rumour and mob judgment. 5. Public trust and charity funds must be protected. The plot in this story fed on stolen hospital money and corrupt boards. Real societies, then and now, must guard the institutions that serve the poor and the sick. 6. Never dismiss the observers. Jodie Burns, a lady's maid, saw what aristocrats missed. Wisdom and courage are not ranked by title, salary, or station. 7. Love is not possession. It is sacrifice, honesty, and protection. The truest measure of the Duke was not his fortune or his fear, but a silver cup he drank so that someone else would live.